Welcome back to Inside the Room with Ed Balls and me, George Osborne.
We're now going to move international. We're going to go onto the world stage and we're going to talk about how, as a new Prime Minister, you manage Britain's place in the world.
It is my great pleasure to welcome Prime Minister Cameron on his first visit to the White House as Prime Minister.
And this relationship isn't, just as you put it, an extraordinary, special relationship. To me, it is also an absolutely essential relationship. We came into this European Council with a victory for common sense on the 2011 EU budget.
Initial reports from the rugged mountains of eastern Afghanistan said Taliban kidnappers killed British aid worker Linda Norgrove.
That Linda could have died as a result of a grenade detonated by the task force during the assault. The Afghan people do not want foreign forces on their soil any longer than necessary, and the British people are rightly impatient for progress. Our forces will not remain in Afghanistan a day longer than is necessary, and I want to bring them home the moment it is safe to do so.
Doing business in Beijing. The Prime Minister has begun his trade mission to China by saying he wants to double business between the countries within 5 years.
One of the things about the UK-China relationship is it is at the very highest level. We have dialogues covering all of these areas, covering obviously the economic and business and trading relationships, but also covering environment and climate change, and also we have a dialogue covering human rights.
Let's start with the personal responsibility of being Prime Minister that we talked about in our first episode, because when you come into that job and our country is at war, as we were at the time in Afghanistan, suddenly from day one, what in opposition was, something you were critiquing, it's your war. The casualties are casualties happening on your watch. If they're hostages that you suddenly are dealing with and responsible for. I mean, it's such a dramatic and I would think difficult transition.
Completely, and I think the war in Afghanistan and the loss of life was something I spent more time and energy and effort thinking and worrying about in particularly those early months. I'd been to Afghanistan, I think probably 5 times between 2005 and 2010. So I'd got to know the issue. I realised how important it was. Pretty much on the first day, we summoned this new National Security Council, appointed this new National Security Advisor, put in place a whole series of things to try and demonstrate the importance with which we took the issue and how much we wanted to focus on it and make sure the troops had the right equipment and everything else. But yes, it has an enormous impact on you. And you feel a great personal responsibility for it.
And although you would go on to be leading or seeking to lead international kind of efforts in Libya and then in Syria, your first instinct in 2010 is to want to withdraw, to set a deadline. You actually said, I think, very early on, 2014 was when you would like to see British troops out of Afghanistan. Obviously, it took rather longer in the end. But what was your thinking?
Well, the very first thing I did was actually to get us out of Sangin, which was a town in Helmand where we had taken a quarter of our casualties were lost in this one town. And this was at the time of the Obama surge, a surge of troops, and he was putting more troops in, and the UK was putting in more troops. But I worked out that we weren't putting in enough troops to have the densities that the Americans were going to have. And I came to the conclusion the right thing to do was to have a frank conversation with the Americans about really focusing on central Helmand, where we could do the job better, and saying we needed them to come and help us in Sangin. And the generals, by and large, didn't really want this to happen. They didn't want to have that conversation, and I thought it was essential that we did. It wasn't that I wanted to get us, I wasn't cutting and running or anything like that. I wanted to do the job properly, but I definitely thought, another 4 years. We'd already been in Afghanistan since 2001. Another 4 years was a reasonable amount of time to say, right, we're going to be committed to it. But by that time, we should have trained up the Afghan army and special forces and police and everything else so that we'll continue to back them with enablers and back them with money, but we shouldn't have combat troops on the ground. And I thought that was the right thing to do.
I mean, there's no doubt that the Prime Minister's job is both to represent the country on the world stage, handle relations with other countries, and to sort of set the overall framework. So you, as you say, I want British soldiers out of Afghanistan. To what degree do you think a Prime Minister needs to be involved in very, very sort of specific decisions? I was quite struck watching you do this job alongside you, that you were quite often having to make really very specific decisions about troop deployments, where submarines were going to be in the world, operational decisions about missile strikes or bombing targets. I mean, is that the job of a prime minister? When you read the kind of war memoirs of Winston Churchill, he gets involved in that, but the generals hate it. Margaret Thatcher is the person who authorizes a submarine to sink the Argentinian ship, the Belgrano, not the captain, not the head of the Navy. To what degree is the prime minister also the commander-in-chief in practice?
Well, I think you have to be. Of course, Her Majesty the Queen was the commander-in-chief, but of course you have to be involved in those decisions because ultimately you own them and you own their consequences. I mean, my chief of the defence staff definitely, particularly David Richards, was of the view, Prime Minister, you set the strategy, leave us to do all the, operations and deliver the strategy. I just don't think that's good enough because you're going to own, if you, whether it's the decision about troop deployments in Afghanistan, you own the consequences. You are accountable for them. And so therefore, you've got to get involved in the detail. And I think it is a cliche, I know, but to say that prime ministers need a long screwdriver with the militaries, you can reach right into the machine and change it. And I think that's necessary.
But you used to ask me sometimes to join you in the Cobra meetings around hostage rescues. And I was not there ex officio because chancellors wouldn't normally sit in those rooms. But sometimes you'd say to me, I just want you as a friend and a kind of sounding board and a second opinion. And I was quite struck. You were being asked to make some very operational decisions, even though you and I have never served in uniform. And at the same time, I remember sitting there thinking, God, thank God we are here, because you also need a bit of sort of common sense at some point.
You end up asking often some quite dumb questions because it's very important the dumb questions are asked. And one of the things I did in Downing Street, I think I was the first Prime Minister since Churchill to say, I want to have a military advisor sitting in my office. And I had a succession of very good former officers from special forces regiments who were brilliant. It wasn't, the MOD was worried about it because they thought it was like an alternative source of advice. It wasn't really. It was to help brief me, to help make sure I was asking the right questions and understood all the circumstances. But if you take this issue of hostage rescue, it seemed to me just morally, we had this policy of saying we're not going to pay ransoms to terrorist organizations, which I think is the right moral position. But if you're going to take that position, you've got to reassure people that you, the Prime Minister, are going to chair those Cobra meetings and ask, where's the hostage? What do we know? Who's got them? Is there a potential for a rescue? What can we do to help? What are other countries doing? You've got to, I felt responsible. You must do that. And sometimes it ended well and sometimes it didn't. But it's very important, I think, the Prime Minister takes that view.
And obviously part of the job is making that final call. The decision, go for the rescue, is the Prime Minister's. It's not the head of the militaries or the Defence Secretary. And there's a chance it won't work. And how do you sort of think about that decision? How do you live with it? Obviously, if it goes well, fantastic. But if it goes badly, as inevitably some will, how do you live with that as a person?
The way I thought about it was, ultimately, you are responsible, you are accountable, so you must be involved in making this decision. It wasn't that you were literally saying, right, it's 0 hour tonight at midnight. It was saying to the MOD and the military, in principle, I authorise this and you can decide exactly when it happens. And I think that's right, because I think the British citizen who's been taken hostage, who's, in some terrible circumstances in Afghanistan or Nigeria or wherever it might be, I think you owe it to them that the highest power in the land, as it were, thought about it and said, we've done everything we can to make this as safe as possible, but we're going to go ahead.
And sometimes they record, obviously with a gun to the head, terrible messages appealing directly to you.
Yeah.
And how did you feel about that?
I think it's very important you watch them. I did watch the terrible circumstances we had with first American and then British hostages taken by Jihadi John and his bunch in Syria, and those videos that were produced and sent. I thought it was very important for the Prime Minister to watch them, so you knew what the families had been through. You knew what had happened. You felt you wanted to get as involved as you could to try and find where they were and to feel their pain over what they had suffered. They were hideous and horrific, but I think it's a very important part of the job. Now, if you paid, some countries do, just pay up the money and, in my view, encourage the terrorists, maybe you take a different view. But I think if you're not going to do that, you owe it to the families to do everything you can to try and rescue them.
This was all happening while you were making quite deep cuts to defence spending, to kind of regiments, to troop numbers. And the chiefs of staff have always kind of thought that it's not the Prime Minister's job to tell us what to do, it's the Prime Minister's job to tell the Treasury what to do. And were you under pressure to stop George cutting defence?
It was very hard. As we said earlier, I mean, George and I were absolutely in harness, and we thought if we're going to ask the public sector to make these savings, you can't exempt the Defence Department. In the end, Defence had a smaller cut than lots of other departments. I think it was about 8%. And we were also having a plan to invest in those things that we needed more of, whether it was drones, whether it was transport aircraft, mobility, all those things that would actually help us fight a modern war and actually rescue hostages and carry out operations such as the ones we're talking about.
The first call you take when you become Prime Minister is from the American president. I mean, how many minutes does it take a British Prime Minister to work out that their premiership is going to be hugely defined by who's sitting in the White House?
Look, it is absolutely true. And you've got to, that's why I said in that clip, it is an essential partnership because many
essential
things,
for the British.
Well, yes, we hope there are. There's no doubt that the American president finds that the work of GCHQ and MI6 and other intelligence agencies is enormously valuable to him. I mean, Britain has some world-class resources that are there for the Americans as well. But there's no doubt that if you want to have an impact in so many of these situations, how you work that relationship with the American president is absolutely crucial.
And do you take the kind of Tony Blair approach, and I'm not being critical, but you felt during the Iraq War, he'd got himself to the point where he was almost like the US Defense Secretary or the US Secretary of State. He was at least in the room able to offer his opinion to the president.
Part of the interagency process, as it was once said to us by the Foreign Office.
or are you, Hugh Grant in Love Actually, since this is Christmas time?
You want to be as involved as you can be to have the maximum impact. But ultimately, a lot will depend on the way a president works. President Obama was quite formal and, had quite a sort of process he'd go through about decisions. And so you'd have to try and work out the best way of making your influence felt.
It was interesting in your biography, you say that Blair Brown, the Labour years were too defined by the US and the EU relationships. Although, isn't your prime ministership very defined by the EU and the US?
The point I was trying to make there was that I think, and I feel this as an ex-foreign secretary as well as an ex-prime minister, is, of course, the EU relationship and the American relationship are absolutely crucial to Britain's future. But that shouldn't mean you ignore some of the other partnerships you can form. I used to find this quite frustrating in the Foreign Office. They'd say, you've got to make choices. And so the choices you've got to make, prioritise Europe, prioritise America. Therefore, we must, cut embassies elsewhere in the world. And I thought that was a nonsense argument. Having too fewer people in America, you barely notice the difference. But put two, economic or trade advisors in the Central Asian republics, they could have a transformative effect. So Britain shouldn't overstate our role, but we have we have businesses that operate all over the world, people who live all over the world. We're an open trading nation. Those relationships matter. And I felt that the Blair Brown years, they'd worked very hard on those two relationships, but actually, foreign secretaries and prime ministers had rather ignored, for instance, no one had been to Australia for years. I was the first prime minister to go to Malaysia for 7 years, the first to go to Indonesia for 10 years, the first ever British prime minister ever to go to Vietnam. These were growing, exciting countries where Britain should be having a good partnership. So my view was a bit more global.
But in the early months, your new Foreign Secretary, William Hague, is cautioning you to not be too advanced in your approach to China.
Yes, so we had a good debate about this. I mean, I was very lucky in that in George and William, we had a team where we totally trusted each other. We could argue ferociously in private, but you never read about any of our disagreements in public. And on China, it's definitely true to say William was more cautious, George was more enthusiastic. I felt that, look, foreign policy and domestic policy are intricately connected. The biggest need we had as a country was for growth, for investment. The economic strategy was the key to what we were doing. And I thought we could do better, as other European countries had done, in our trading relationship with China. So I was determined to give it give it a good push.
I'm not sure if I understand. I mean, so on Europe, I understand.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if I understand why the Conservative Party, since your time as Prime Minister, has moved to such a antagonistic approach to China.
No, I think quite a lot has changed in terms of China. I mean, since my time in office, we've had obviously the situation in Hong Kong, the situation with the Uyghurs. We've had the sanctioning of Conservative members of Parliament. We've had the sort of wolf warrior diplomacy from China, beating up on either whether it's Australia or Lithuania. I think quite a lot of things have changed that make it harder.
So your approach didn't work?
No, I think my approach was right for its time because it was about getting that investment, that trading relationship. And as it was said in the clip, the dialogue was at a very high level, so you could raise all the human rights cases in that way. But I think since then it has become...
you were trying to draw them into a different relationship, and in the end they chose not to come
ultimately,
with you.
Circumstances have changed, and so we need a different approach. But we should be careful, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater.
And so we did a big trip to China in November 2010.
Yeah.
You took lots of cabinet ministers, lots of business leaders to try and kickstart that investment. I mean, there's obviously a criticism levelled, I think, at all prime ministers, certainly the current one, that he spends too much time abroad.
Yeah.
And what do you think of the role of the prime minister? I mean, can a prime minister spend too much time abroad, or is that, frankly, whether the public, or more to the point, the press like it or not, that's like the job. You're the country's chief representative.
I found it frustrating how quick the trips had to be. The pressure was always on to get there and get back as fast as you can because of the domestic agenda. And I accepted that, and I did. I had to curtail and shorten trips and all the rest of it. But the British Prime Minister is responsible for leading that foreign policy. You wanted to spend more
time abroad with the British lobby who travel with us on those planes.
No, I might have left some of them behind. But, as Foreign Secretary, I really enjoyed the ability to... So, for instance, I did a tour of all the stans. I did 6 countries in 6 days. First British Prime Minister to go to Mongolia, I think, ever. The Mongolians have just decided to have English as a second language. That is a massive opportunity for us. Okay, albeit in a small but important country. You do need your leader to visit these countries and forge a relationship. I think the kind of problem of never hear Keir or whatever it is, or the criticism I had, if you have a clear domestic strategy, then you get less of that. It's just, the press will love to attack you for travelling, but they find it particularly easy if you're not clear about what your central purpose is.
Let's return to the UK, though, for our final set of clips, because... these are, towards the end of your first 6 months, the straws in the wind, the emerging issues, which are going to turn out to be more and more complicating as the months and years go on up to kind of the end of your term. And just interested to know how you react to hearing this set of clips.
The doorstep of the Conservative Party's headquarters. Just 1 week after the government announced its plans for the future of universities.
As someone who claims to be an avid fan of the Smiths, the Prime Minister will no doubt be rather upset this week to hear that both Morrissey and Johnny Marr have banned him from liking them. The Smiths are, of course, the archetypal student band. If he wins tomorrow night's vote, what songs does he think students will be listening to? Miserable Lie, I Don't Owe You Anything, or Heaven Knows I'm Miserable Now?
Ed Miliband in the MPs and MEPs section received 15.522%, in the members section 15.198%, and in the affiliates 19.934%.
The reaction of the audience said it all, even if the final number got lost in the sound of applause. Ed Miliband is the new leader of the Labour Party, beating older brother David by the narrowest of margins.
Vince Cable has said in an undercover interview with the Telegraph newspaper that he has declared war on Rupert Murdoch. Of course, Vince Cable is the present business secretary. Declaring war, suggestions that you are declaring war on somebody that you are trying to be impartial about, is perhaps not the best phraseology to use.
No, I think that's probably right, and I suspect Vince regrets some of the things he said.
It was completely wrong. It was totally inappropriate what he did. He acknowledges that himself. Cameron and I decided very, very quickly that for all the obvious reasons, he should be removed from any further role in taking the decision on that deal.
Pressure was mounting on Ireland as it was running out of money.
So Britain stands ready to support Ireland in the steps that it needs to take to to bring about that stability.
Protests in the capital, Cairo, and protests in the coastal city of Alexandria.
It's so easy for us to look back now on those weeks and, with our knowledge of the subsequent history, kind of impose a frame on events. But of course, for you then as Prime Minister, you don't know what is going to happen. How do you try day to day when you've got all these events coming at you to work out what are the things which are going to be transitory, the things which are going to be kind of significant but not a big deal, and then to see the events which, if I don't get on top of this now, this is going to potentially become a huge problem, whether that is the Arab Spring or Bangladesh rebellion on Europe or whatever. How do you do that as a Prime Minister?
What I tried to do was work out what was genuinely transitory, i.e. a sort of sudden scandal in a newspaper that you had to just deal with. You had to, get that out of the way. Then you've got those things where it's part of an emerging pattern. And Europe, which I'm sure we'll come on to, there was a sort of emerging pattern going back actually ever since the Lisbon Treaty and the failure to have a referendum on that, a sort of emerging pattern which you've got to sort of manage. And then you've got those things that go wrong where U-turns, everyone has to make U-turns. When you make them quickly and make them frankly. It's a bit like apologising in politics. People who say, I'm sorry if I offended you, I think is one of the most annoying things. If you're going to apologise, do it properly. Just say, sorry, I got it wrong. I'm going to learn the lessons. And I think so we tried to do that mixture of things, where you have to U-turn swiftly and brutally, try and manage the day so you get... Because looking back, I can't remember which minister resigned over what scandal and who was in bed with who and what. I can't remember any of that. But you remember the big calls you made, both those things you think you got right and the things you got wrong. And the key is to try and spend as long as you can on the big calls, the things that really matter.
But listening to all those clips, what's interesting is, first of all, there's Vince Cable having to resign over, Vince Cable
having to recuse himself from the decision about Murdoch.
Yeah. There's Vince Cable having to recuse himself over the decision on Rupert Murdoch's attempt to take over Sky. And I'm not saying it was a small story at the time, it was quite a big story, but I think it would have been hard to predict at that point that a few months later it was going to plunge the government into complete crisis over Leveson. And I personally think of the 5 years we spent in coalition with the Liberal Democrats, the closest we came to breaking up was actually over Leveson. And there was definitely a week when I felt the kind of floor starting to open up beneath the government of...
I thought the closest we came was when they voted against the boundary review. You remember the Lords reform doesn't go through and they take revenge on it by voting against the boundaries. And I felt that was a breach of a very clear promise. And if you remember, I was furious at the time. I think you sort of hosed me down and said, look, we've got to get on with these people, so come on. But I felt very, very deeply let down by that.
Yeah, well, no, fair enough, although, we're not doing. We'll get you back for talking about 2012, just a couple of years ahead. But no, I'm just saying that kind of there's something that kind of soon becomes a big scandal for the government, Leveson. Whereas interestingly, the Arab Spring, you see, here we're doing this podcast in just a week after the extraordinary events in Syria, and I don't think watching all those things unfolding in Tunisia and Egypt at the tail end of 2010. I really anticipated that this was going to have a huge impact, not just on our world, but on us, on the UK, because it was going to lead to the fall of governments in the Middle East, that would lead to the migration flows, that would lead to immigration becoming an even more difficult issue for us, and of course all the without jumping way ahead, but tying it to the European issue, making Europe not just a question of money, but also a question of immigration. And that would have been hard, I think, to predict at the time. But maybe I was too narrowly focused.
We're a slightly different age. I think we're all prisoners of our history. To me, one of the most formative things in my political life was 1989, 1990, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the fall of communism in Eastern Europe. I'd travelled through the Soviet Union in my year between school and university. I was so sort of cognizant of that when the Arab Spring broke out, I did, and Ed Llewellyn, same generation, same age, working with me, we've thought this is a very big moment. Maybe the same with Europe. I mean, I was working for Norman Lamont with the ERM when we fell out of the exchange rate mechanism. And I mean, I learned a lot then, I think, about the dangers of deepening the Eurozone. And that conditioned my views about that. So I think sometimes if you see a trend emerging that fits with your view, maybe then you latch onto it more.
And you knew, even at the end of 2010, that you had a more Eurosceptical intake of new MPs in 2010 than in previous generations, that you tried to reform the 1922 committee in May, and that hadn't worked, to try and strengthen the government voice in its deliberations. And we heard there from Peter Bone.
Yes.
And
the thing we didn't, sorry to interrupt, but the thing we did, so Clegg and I agreed after the election. I remember saying to Clegg, well, look, one thing we're probably not going to have to deal with is, a big blow up in Europe and treaty change, because the Lisbon Treaty, albeit I'd wanted the referendum on it, it had been implemented by every government, including your one. And so there was no threat, we thought. But yet within 6 months, we were back in Europe with, it was only a tiny treaty change about bailout clauses and things like that, but we were straight back into European issues coming to the fore. So we didn't foresee that, but it pretty soon became clear that we hadn't seen the last of treaty change.
I'm so tempted to, I want to say to you, you should have stayed in the room in the negotiation of the six-pack treaty to help sort out the European kind of bailout rules. But that's not what we're doing today. We're just doing the first 6 months. But did you know how much of a political management challenge you were going to face within the Conservative Party in 2010?
Not straight away, because I thought we had a good strategy. We had this referendum lock, which we legislated for, that if there was ever a proposal to move power from Westminster to Brussels, there would be a referendum. So we thought that was part one. And we thought because the Lisbon Treaty had gone through, there wouldn't be new treaties straight away. So we thought we were going to get a period of quiet on Europe. But that was the very opposite of what happened, because, of course, you have the Eurozone crisis, and the Eurozone crisis then drives more treaty change, and then we're straight back into the old arguments. So I think if you'd asked me at the end of 2010, or certainly in 2011, is Europe going to be an emerging problem for your government, I would have said yes. But I think in May 2010, I didn't think it was going to be.
And you definitely both knew. I mean, I'm not sure whether you knew that tuition fees weren't going to turn out to be a big problem for the Conservatives. And I don't think they were. But you knew at the end of 2010 that Nick Clegg had made a massive decision.
Yes. So we had this, cabinet meeting. It wasn't a cabinet meeting. It was a quad meeting of so George Osborne, Danny Alexander, me, and Nick Clegg, where we discussed what we were going to do with tuition fees, and Nick says, Nick wasn't really in favour of his previous policy and said, I'm going to support this policy because a lot of work's gone into it. I think it is a good policy. I'm going to support it. And George turns around and says, I don't think you should do that.
You looked at me like, what the hell are you doing?
I looked thinking, we're trying to get this policy through Parliament. You're not really helping.
But I thought your principle was don't break your promises.
Well, I know, but that was my principle for me. I wasn't going to. But I think my principle became stronger when I watched what happened to Nick, because I think it was an absolutely classic example of a promise only you can break.
Unbelievable.
Look, my concern was to get the legislation through, because this was a very important part of making sure that universities could go on growing even while we were making difficult spending decisions.
By the way, has led to a really successful 10 years for universities subsequently.
And we also had the arrival of Ed Miliband as leader of the Labour Party. Now, I think one of the reflections I have from our time in government is that having a strong leader of the opposition is really important for the success of a government, because it keeps you on your toes.
Yes.
It forces you to keep focused on the next election.
Yes.
The truth was William Hague was a good performer in an impossible position in the first Parliament, 1997 to 2001. But the truth is, for us, the election of Ian Duncan Smith as a Conservative leader was a disaster, because he was so weak in Parliament and more widely that it just meant all the focus was on Blair and Brown and the government's internal arguments, because there was nothing going on with the Conservatives. How did you feel when Ed Miliband became leader of the Labour Party?
No, I thought actually I most saw him at Prime Minister's Questions where he was good. I thought he was quite effective. And I wasn't that focused really on what he was doing in terms of policy in the Labour Party. But I thought in terms of, his performance in Parliament and what he was doing generally in communicating, I thought he was doing, he was keeping us on our toes, definitely.
Yes, but I mean, at the time, you and I definitely wanted him elected rather than David Miliband. And William thought, actually, we'd have more trouble with Ed Miliband.
I think you were more certain. I was...
You were definitely wrong, George. The thing
I
is,
was somewhere in the middle. I thought that actually there was something authentic. There was something rather authentic about Ed Miliband and what he believed and what he said. He just didn't, look, life's around fair. I remember sort of a moment when I realised how things were going to go. I was speaking in one of those big entertainment halls at a racing stadium somewhere, and the news was on, and it was Nick Clegg speaking, and on the other channel was Ed Miliband, and the sound was turned down, and I was speaking, and I was making a speech, but out of the corner of my eye, I was watching them. And there's something about watching politicians with the sound turned down. You can sort of tell, how it's going to go. and at that moment, I thought maybe I got a chance.
What he was much better at than his brother was taking the argument and telling the story to you in Parliament. I think David was always apologising for what had happened. In that sort of Nadine Dorries phrase, two posh boys who don't know the price of milk, he was good at playing that card, and that did put you under pressure.
Totally. No, I remember.
I know, but
it's in the book. I mean, when we had the discovery that actually Ed Miliband had given an interview in one of his two kitchens, and when that came out, that was I remember because that was suddenly the posh stuff I was getting sort of was cast to one side as I could tell a whole lot of corny jokes about how if he couldn't stand the heat, he had to get out of one of his two kitchens, which I know sounds very childish. But I had so much abuse about posh boy and Eton and all this that when I could finally put the boot on the other foot, it was quite enjoyable.
So we're coming to the end now. So we've reached Christmas in 2010. You've been Prime Minister for just over 6 months. I don't know, did you have Christmas at Chequers that year or?
I don't remember. We certainly did have a couple of Christmases at Chequers, and they were lovely actually, because you're able to think about Chequers. You can go on working, but you also get masses of time with your family because everything's taken care of. So I mean, it's an amazing luxury, but it does actually help you do the job.
Opposition is growing. Student riots.
Yeah.
Labour have got a full-time leader of the opposition. But I mean, I was struck. Knowing you extremely well, you just enjoyed the job. By the end of that year, okay, it's been full on. Not everything has gone right, but basically, you've made the transition to Prime Minister well. The public sees you as someone who can do the job. There's an economic plan, which is certainly controversial, but at least it's a plan that we are authors of. And fundamentally, you get up every morning and you go, I'm really enjoying being Prime Minister. Is that fair?
No. I mean, I did enjoy the job. I really did. It was an immensely fulfilling thing to do.
I think it's good to enjoy it.
Yes, you've got to enjoy it. But you ought to enjoy it if you can. But you're never relaxed. I mean, you might have some days of relaxation over Christmas, but there's always something you're worried about, and there's always a problem.
So if not enjoyment, is it fulfilling? Maybe it's a kind of profound sense of fulfillment?
I think the difference, obviously, when you're leader of the opposition, you've just got words, things you can say. Suddenly, as Prime Minister, you can do things and get things done. And even when you get into a hole and you're in a bad place because something's gone wrong, you can get out of it because you've got the ability to turn it around. So I found it incredibly satisfying, and there are lots of lovely parts of the job about whether you're dealing with the armed forces or whether you're your interaction with Her Majesty the Queen or the places you're going, the people you're meeting, and sort of inspiring social entrepreneurs and all the rest of it. So there's always things that light up your day, but there are you're permanently worried, permanently stressed, and you'll think. I mean, I used to think quite a bit about one day I won't be Prime Minister, and I won't have this stress. So although I was enjoying it, the stress is immense.
Can I ask you about David Cameron, the dad and the son? You're at Christmas with your family, new baby Florence, but this is the first Christmas in your life when you don't have your dad with you. And I think, how do you find the time amongst all of those pressures and stresses you're describing to be the person, to celebrate and also to grieve?
Well, the arrival of Florence was just, unalloyed joy. We were on holiday in Cornwall and, went to the hospital, the local hospital, because Samantha was having some contractions. And she sort of thought the doctor was very nice. And when he said, look, you could go on a train back to London or we could just do it now. And she said, right, let's get on with it. And so we had a cesarean there. And then, half an hour later, I was holding a newborn baby. And it was lovely, actually, having a child on holiday, because although we all love our parents visiting and everything else, actually just being alone as a family with your newborn made it particularly special. So that, and having the family in Downing Street does actually work, because you're able to pop upstairs and read a bedside story or bedtime story or whatever. But obviously losing my dad was heartbreaking, because he was getting quite infirm, but I definitely didn't think he was reaching the end of his life. And then in September, he was on holiday in France and had a sort of combination of stroke and a heart attack. And that all happened on a Wednesday when I was meant to be doing Prime Minister's Questions. And I got this call, and I remember it like it was yesterday. I got this call from my mum saying her dad's been taken ill. I'm really worried about it. And so, I jump in a car to get to the airport to fly out to the south of France, talk with the other brothers and sisters about what they're doing. We're all getting on a flight from City Airport, and then Mum rings and says, actually, I think it's not so bad. I think he's stabilised. And so I turn the car around, say goodbye to my brothers and sisters, ring Nick Clegg and say, I was going to get you to do Prime Minister's Questions, but don't worry, I can now do it. And then the phone rings in the car, and it's Nicolas Sarkozy, President of France. And he says, David, I know your dad's really, really unwell. I've spoken to the doctor in the hospital. You've got to turn the car back around and get on that airplane. Which I did. And then the plane lands in I think, Nice Airport, and there's a helicopter waiting, which Nicolas Sarkozy has arranged. And he flies me in the helicopter and my family. We land on the roof of the hospital in Marseille. And I get to see my dad literally just before he died. So it was, I've had my rows with Sarkozy over the years, but whenever I see him, I always give him this big hug and thank him for letting me see my dad before he died.
And then you spend the night in the French president's castle, which the French president has on the south coast of France, and with your brothers and your mum and so on. So your father's died, but you basically
we celebrated his life. It's extraordinary. That's the thing.
And he would have loved it, right? I knew your dad, and he would have absolutely loved
it. It's
poking
called
his nose round the
Chateau of Rochebrune or something.
It's on the wine cellar.
It's on the coast, but it was very striking because Sarkozy had also arranged sort of two small naval ships to be off the coast. He put a sort of guard of honor around my father's coffin and everything. And then let us stay in his house, where, yes, I admit we did raid the wine cellar and we toasted Dad. Because I remember saying, "Gosh, Dad would have loved this," and Mum said, "Well, actually, he'd really love to be here."
But does and presumably there's part of you that is thrilled that he got to see you become Prime Minister, because quite often there are Prime Ministers, including the current Prime Minister, whose parents died before they became Prime Ministers, can't see what their son achieved or their daughter achieved.
He came to Chequers just before he went on holiday, and I remember him saying, "Oh, everything's going wrong. I've lost both my legs. I've lost sight in an eye. There are fewer and fewer things I can do. It's very frustrating." But so, and he was very proud. But I didn't think he was about to go. I thought he could be looking forward to many more years of life. He was very proud. He was always very nervous. He was always very worried about all the effects it would have on the family and whether we'd be able to cope and everything. But he was very proud as well.
Well, as a close friend of yours still, it's amazing how your family are so normal and wonderful and supportive of you and you of them, and seem to have been amazingly unscathed by all the events we've been talking about.
I think they've developed a series of strategies for dealing with these things.
But hearing you talk about this, and George talks about being normal, and this is just such an abnormal thing to be the Prime Minister. And normally, when you lose a loved one, you need time to be alone, time to just stop doing the day-to-day. And it's really hard to do that when you're the Prime Minister. And was it possible for you to feel like a normal person grieving? Did people try to make that possible? Or how did you deal with that?
It's a very good question. You try and find a bit of space in which to sort of think about what's happened and take some sort of time away from the daily. But it's hard to, but you try. Obviously, I lost my son Ivan back when I was leader of the opposition, and then I sometimes think I almost went back to work too quickly. I think it's very important to find time to think these things through. But we all have our different ways of dealing with them. And maybe some of the sort of getting back to work and getting on with it is helpful. But everyone has their own. I wouldn't ever, my wife and I have totally different ways of handling these things.
I think knowing that your dad would be really proud of what you did is such a good thing to have.
Yeah, but also he was somewhere he loved, he had these lost his legs and everything, and so there was, I think, when he was obviously going, I think my mother was sort of, she'd come to terms. She sort of could see what was happening and had come to terms with it.
We're almost at the end of our time. We've been talking about your first 6 months in Downing Street. But obviously, we've just had a general election this year, and we have not only a new leader of the opposition in Kemi Badenoch, but also a new Prime Minister has been in Downing Street for close to 6 months. And I wondered whether over these 6 months, when you've been watching what's happening in Downing Street with Keir Starmer or the new Tory opposition leader, have there been moments when you've thought, guys, I wrote a book, I set it all out, the lessons are there, you're making the same mistakes, what is going on? Have there been moments where you've been really frustrated like that?
Of course there are moments when you sort of think, gosh, I went through that, why don't pick up the phone and ask me.
Have they?
But on the other hand, no.
No.
Kemi Badenoch has. Kemi Badenoch has.
She has.
But actually, when I was Prime Minister, I met with Blair quite a lot. I met with John Major. There are a lot of lessons.
You got a letter from Gordon Brown when you arrived?
I did. Very good letter it was too. I think there are lessons you can learn.
So when should Keir Starmer pick the phone up?
I don't know. I mean, I've always had reasonable relations with him when I see him at the Cenotaph and things like that. I think that his problem is more related to there just wasn't enough warning about what was coming. Maybe I overdo this thing.
Warning from him, you mean?
Warning from him.
He didn't lay the ground.
He didn't lay the groundwork. Maybe I'm too influenced by this thing. I always think the first sort of 6 months or even 3 months of becoming leader of the opposition or prime minister, just so important. And most people aren't interested in politics that much. But when something changes, they have a look and they decide whether you're basically doing the right thing and worth kind of giving a chance to or not. And I think that has been a problem for him. Although that said, he didn't make a particularly strong impression when he was first leader of the Labour Party. So maybe he's better in the second half of the game.
Have there been moments where you've thought, actually, good call, handled that well?
Yes, I think some of his interactions with foreign leaders, I think he makes a good fist of that. I think some of the things, the suits and the glasses and the clothes, they're just, you can avoid all that, I'm not saying, of course, Samantha had the odd dress that Central Office would pay for because there are lots of things you have to do as leader of the opposition or Prime Minister's wife or what have you. But a lot of those things are just totally avoidable. Anyway, so that's that.
But isn't there kind of over... I think, and obviously I'm so party-proof, I think, the Cameron opposition had a plan. They had a plan to take tough measures to get the economy back on track, plan to reform education. And basically, although we were in coalition, we delivered the plan. And by the end of the first 6 months, no one would say, I voted for the Conservatives and I did not expect this.
Yes.
And
in opposition, we had lots of false starts and we had lots of things that didn't work. But fundamentally, we came into government with a plan and, as you say, executed that plan. And so people, even if they disagreed with it, we had permission. And I think that's terribly important in politics because, otherwise people just don't know what they're getting.
And for all the whining about Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves, blaming the inheritance, blaming the past, the 22 billion black hole. I mean, you guys, you definitely blamed your predecessors.
But we inherited a 10% budget deficit, right?
Have you got anyone in mind, Ed?
Yeah.
I'm just saying, you are not going to be sanctimonious about that.
No, we're not being sanctimonious about it. I would say that, one, we warned people in advance. Two, the inheritance of a 10% budget deficit, GDP, was absolutely massive. And three, there was quite a lot of lightness in the message. At the same time as these very difficult decisions, we were lifting the lowest paid people out of tax. There was quite a lot. We were trying to fire up the engines of entrepreneurship and tech and all the rest of it. There was, it wasn't... this first period has been excessively gloomy. And I think they need to try and fix that.
And you are 2/3 of the way through the first 6 months for Kemi Badenoch, and you have been on the phone with her. So any advice you're going to share with us?
I think it's a much tougher job than when I had to do it because, of course, she's only got 123 MPs and you've got the reform situation. And also I was able to take over after William Hague and Michael Howard and all the rest of it, and she's the first leader after a catastrophic defeat. So it's a much harder job.
They don't win, do they? First leaders after catastrophic defeats.
I think life has changed because...
He was not the first leader after a catastrophic defeat. The catastrophic defeat was 2010, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Well, 2019 you could have.
Oh, well, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I think politics has got much more fluid. And I think she's got some strong things in the tank in that, no one asks, as they did with me, is he really a Conservative? What does he think? With her, everyone goes, absolutely, strong, instinctive, Conservative, very clear views. So she's got some things she starts off with. But it's an incredibly tough job.
Do you miss it?
I miss lots of it. I even miss bits of being leader of the opposition, but not that many bits because it was. Lots of bits you miss, and I really enjoyed coming back as Foreign Secretary because it was like getting back onto a bicycle, knowing how to ride a bicycle. Because you've done all your apprenticeship, as it were, as Prime Minister, and you get straight back into trying to have an effect, trying to get things done.
The Foreign Office would love hearing you describe being Prime Minister as an apprenticeship to being Foreign Secretary.
It was so funny, though. But it was so funny because Rishi Sunak, as far as I could see, makes a conference speech in which he dumps on you and George and all previous Conservative leaders and the establishment of the past decades. And then a week later, you're back in the Foreign Office. You must have been staggered.
I was very surprised.
You must have been amazed.
I mean, when I went to see him in Downing Street, we were talking about all sorts of things, and I had my sort of overcoat next to on the sofa, and I kept picking up my coat and saying, I really must go because you're very busy and I'm not busy at all. And he kept saying, no, hold on a second, I've got one more thing I want to ask you. And then he'd ask something else, and it was only right at the end that he said, would you like to be Foreign Secretary? And I was so shocked. I mean, I said yes much more quickly than I thought I would.
You must have been amazed.
I was pretty amazed. Did you have
any indication?
I had no indication. I had previously thought, one day if someone offered me that job, I'd love to do it because I care so much about what Britain does overseas and how we handle those relationships. And you sort of feel as a Prime Minister, you've got that expertise, you've got all those relationships. So I did think one day it would be a great thing to do. And I went home and, luckily Samantha agreed and said, yes, okay, if you want to do it, I suppose so. The best was my daughter Nancy, who said, oh, Dad, it's a nightmare. I'm at university. I really don't need this. But look, here's my price. Lunch at Downing Street, tea at Chequers. If you can fix that, I'm in. I got her into Downing Street, but actually we never made it to Chequers, so I'd rather let my daughter down, but I'll have to make it up.
Sorry, Keir's listening.
I think it could be sorted. In your book, you say that when you called Ian Duncan Smith in 2010, he thought it was a spoof.
No, that was Anne Widdecombe.
Yes.
Oh,
Anne Widdecombe. I called her. The ambassadorship in the Vatican has become vacant, and I thought, who is Britain's most prominent Catholic? Right. And so I rang Anne Widdecombe, and Anne Widdecombe always used to slightly have a go at me about, I don't think you take politics seriously enough, you're not serious enough, and all the rest of it. And so when I said to her, first of all, she thought it was a hoax. And I had to say, no, really as the Prime Minister. If you remember, we were talking in the tea room a week ago about prison reform. And she said, OK, I accept as the Prime Minister. I said, well, would you like to be ambassador to the Vatican? And she said, well, it's very kind of you to ask, but actually I can't because I'm going on Strictly. And I thought, well, that's it.
So did you think it was a hoax from Rishi Sunak?
No, because I was in the room with him.
Right.
So, but the
And you also
the
weren't-
phone call was lined up, I think, by somebody else.
Okay.
Also, Ed, David wasn't booked on Strictly.
Yeah.
I know. Although I think
I really enjoyed
it's
working
not
with
too
him,
late.
actually.
Not too late.
My theory is that, okay, he had done some things which I totally disagree with, like on HS2. And he could see that I went to see him. I argued vigorously. I said, I'm going to attack your decision. I will make a statement. But after that, that'll be that, because I don't want to be a running sore for the government. I'm going to make my position. And I was true to my word. I didn't, get out of bed every day and hammer him over these things. I just said what I was going to say.
That's because you were the Foreign Secretary.
No. This was before. My point is that I think, I think before he appointed me, he could see that while we had our disagreements, they were largely in private. And if I said I was going to disagree in public, I did, but in the way that I said I was going to.
I mean, let's find maybe final question, if I'm allowed to. I just
we are overrunning, but we could go on for another hour.
Yeah, I mean, you actually enjoyed being leader of the opposition, although I think it's the hardest job in politics. I use the word enjoyed for how I think you took to the premiership, although you say it was also very stressful and fulfilling. It's been so interesting listening to you talk about it all. And I mean, everyone who knows you just knows the moment you became Foreign Secretary, you almost sort of physically sort of grew. You were just back doing what you love. Could you, there are lots of other jobs in public life. There may well be another Tory government in our lifetime. So the call may come again.
Well, let's hope we're not all too old, George. That's the I public service I find more interesting and fascinating and satisfying than anything else. And so when you get that chance, it's great to take it. There aren't that many opportunities, internationally and elsewhere. So you have to do other things. And I'm having lots of interesting times with Alzheimer's and rare diseases at Oxford and all sorts of things. But no, the chance to serve is when you get offered, I think you want to take it.
Well, you did.
That feels like a good place to end with, the prospect of a David Cameron return still hanging in the air as
an
a
Ed Balls one too,
possibility. But we are at the end of this edition of Inside the Room. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. David Cameron, former Prime Minister.
I've enjoyed it very much. Thanks.